Esther. Did you know that the story of Esther is not just about courage, but also about a divine plan for the salvation of a people? In this video, we will explore how Esther and Mordecai changed the destiny of the Jews in the Persian Empire, and how this story teaches us about faith and courage. If you have ever faced challenges, Esther's lessons can offer inspiration to overcome your difficulties. So, if you want to discover more stories of faith and overcoming, subscribe to our channel and activate the bell so you don't miss anything. Esther is one of the most courageous and admired figures in the Bible, known for her beauty, wisdom, and, most importantly, her bravery in a situation that required courage. As a young Jewish woman who became Queen of Persia, Esther found herself in a crucial position to save her people from imminent annihilation. In this video, we will explore the incredible story of Esther, her courage in the face of dangerous intrigue, and how her faith guided her in protecting her people. Join us on a journey through the pages of the Bible to discover how Esther's boldness and faith changed the course of history and saved her people. The story of Esther unfolds during the Babylonian exile, which resulted from Israel's persistent disobedience to God. Despite the warnings of the prophets, Israel continued to indulge in idolatry and injustice, leading God to allow Nebuchadnezzar to conquer Babylon, destroy the temple, and take many Israelites into exile. Decades later, the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great, who allowed many exiles, including the Jews, to return. They returned to their homeland and rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy about the length of the exile. However, many Jews chose to remain in the lands of exile, now part of the vast Persian Empire. Notable among the Jews who remained were Esther and her cousin Mordecai, who lived in the Persian capital of Susa. The events narrated take place in the vast Persian Empire during the reign of Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes. Ahasuerus ruled over a total of 127 provinces, from India to Ethiopia, demonstrating the power and extent of his kingdom. In the third year of his reign, Ahasuerus organized a great banquet in Susa to display his wealth and the glory of his majestic kingdom. The banquet, which lasted for many days, culminated in a celebration for all the people in the courtyard of the royal palace garden. During this last week of festivities, King Ahasuerus, already in a state of euphoria, ordered Queen Vashti to appear before the guests and show off her beauty, for she was indeed very beautiful. However, Queen Vashti refused the king's request, which caused great indignation in Ahasuerus. Vashti's refusal was seen not only as an act of personal disobedience, but also as a threat to order and royal authority throughout the kingdom. The king's advisors feared that Vashti's example would encourage other women to disobey their husbands and cause disorder. So one of the advisors, Mukin, argued before the king and the princes that the queen had sinned not only against Ahasuerus, but also against all the princes and the people of the provinces, because her actions would reach the ears of all the women and lower their esteem for their husbands. As a result, Ahasuerus decided to remove Vashti from her position as queen. A royal decree was issued proclaiming that Vashti would no longer be queen and that a new queen would be sought in her place. This decree also reinforced the authority of husbands over their wives throughout the kingdom. So Ahasuerus ordered that the most beautiful maidens from all the provinces of the Persian Empire be gathered together and brought to the palace at Susa, where they would be placed under the care of Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the harem. The eunuch in charge of the king's household was responsible for preparing young women to appear before Ahasuerus. The account says that the king's servants and courtiers were to seek out young virgins of good appearance. The king was to send people to all the provinces of his kingdom to bring the beautiful young virgins to his royal residence, which was the house of the women, under the care of Haggai, and that these young women were to be given appropriate attire. The maiden who pleased the king was to reign in Vashti's place. This proposal pleased the king, who accepted it. Among the young women brought to the palace was Esther, an orphan Jew who was raised by her cousin Mordecai. Esther, whose Hebrew name was Hadassah, kept her Jewish identity a secret, following Mordecai's advice. She was strikingly beautiful, which made her stand out among the other young women. When her parents died, Mordecai adopted her as his daughter. Like the other maidens, Esther was placed under Haggai's care and quickly gained his favor, receiving special treatment and being placed in the best rooms. For a year, Esther and the other young women received excellent care. The account mentions that the young woman pleased Haggai and found favor in his eyes, which led him to provide her with food and grant her 7 special maidens from the king's house, as well as to take her to the best rooms. Finally, it was Esther's turn to appear before King Ahasuerus. She asked for nothing more than what Haggai recommended, trusting in his advice and her own beauty. When she was presented to the king, he was deeply impressed by her beauty and grace. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and finding in her both favor and benevolence, he placed a royal crown on her head, making her queen in place of Busti. To celebrate Esther's selection as queen, King Ahasuerus held a great banquet, known as the Feast of Esther, which was declared a holiday in all the provinces of the kingdom. He also bestowed many royal gifts, showing his appreciation for the new queen. Meanwhile, Mordecai, his cousin and protector, continued to perform his duties at the palace gate. Once, while Mordecai was at his post, he overheard a conversation between Bigtan and Teresh, 2 of King Ahasuerus' eunuchs, who were plotting to assassinate the king. Upon learning of the plot, Mordecai reported it to Queen Esther, who in turn informed the king of the conspiracy, giving Mordecai credit. After discovering the plot, the king ordered an investigation, which confirmed the veracity of the plot, resulting in the execution of Bigtan and Teresh. The incident was recorded in the King's Chronicles. Although Mordecai saved the king's life, he received no immediate reward or recognition for his loyalty and bravery. Meanwhile, Haman, the son of Hammedatha, an Agagite, was promoted by King Ahasuerus to a position of great power and authority, being elevated above the other princes. Ahasuerus ordered all the king's servants who were at the palace gate to bow down and kneel before Haman as a sign of respect. However, Mordecai, who worked at the palace gate, refused to bow down or kneel before Haman. This refusal angered Haman, who decided to take revenge not only on Mordecai, but on all the Jewish people in the kingdom. Haman despised the Jews and used Mordecai's disobedience as an excuse to eradicate them. When he saw that Mordecai would not bow down or humble himself before him, he became enraged. Haman then sought to destroy all the Jews in the kingdom, using his influence with the king to come up with a plan for their extermination. He informed the king that there were a people scattered throughout the provinces who followed different laws and did not obey the king's orders, suggesting that this would be in the best interest of the kingdom. To persuade the king, Haman offered to pay a large sum of money into the royal treasury if his plan were approved. King Ahasuerus, trusting Haman, gave him his signet ring, giving him the authority to issue decrees in the king's name. Haman then wrote letters to all the provinces, ordering the destruction, killing, and extermination of all the Jews, including children, young men, and women, on a single day. The day set for this atrocity was the 13th day of the month of Adar. The king's scribes were called in on the first day of the month and on the 13th day, and what Haman ordered was written down for the king's satraps and the princes of each city, and sealed with the king's ring. The letters were sent by messengers to all the provinces, ordering the destruction of the Jews and the confiscation of their property. This decree caused great consternation and grief among the Jews throughout the kingdom. Mordecai and the Jewish people began to cry out for divine help in the face of this threat of annihilation. When Mordecai heard of the decree, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out through the city, wailing loudly. He reached the king's gate but could not enter, because no one wearing sackcloth was allowed to enter that gate. News of the decree and Mordecai's lament reached Esther through her servants and eunuchs. Concerned, Esther sent clothes to Mordecai, but he refused. So Esther sent Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to her service, to learn more about the situation and the reason for Mordecai's behavior. Mordecai explained everything that had happened and gave her a copy of the decree, asking her to intercede with the king on behalf of her people. He also requested that Esther go to the king to plead and intercede for her people. Hathach returned with Mordecai's message, and Esther wrote back to him, explaining the danger of appearing before the king without being summoned. She pointed out that anyone who entered the inner court without an invitation could be put to death unless the king extended his golden scepter as a sign of forgiveness. Esther had not been summoned to the king's presence in the past 30 days. He asked Hathach to inform her. Mordecai was told that all the king's servants and the people of the provinces knew that anyone, whether man or woman, who entered the inner court to see the king without being summoned, according to an established law, must die unless the king extended his hand with the golden scepter. Mordecai sent a clear reply to Esther, reminding her that her position as queen would not protect her from the decree, and that perhaps she had attained that position precisely to meet a moment of crisis. Mordecai warned Esther not to think that she would escape in the king's house any more than any other Jew. He warned her that if she remained silent at this time, deliverance for the Jews would come from elsewhere, but she and her father's house would perish. He questioned whether this was the reason she had come to the kingdom. Esther, realizing the gravity of the situation, challenged Mordecai, asking him to gather all the Jews in Susa to fast for her for 3 days and nights. While she and her servants were also fasting, Esther prepared to appear before the king, willing to risk her life. Esther told Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa to fast in the same way. She would go see the king, even though she knew it was against the law, and she declared that if she were to die, she would die. On the 3rd day, she put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, opposite the king's hall. When the king saw Esther standing in the courtyard, he held out his golden scepter to her and allowed her to approach. When King Ahasuerus saw Queen Esther, he asked her what she wanted and offered her any request, up to half the kingdom. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and went into the inner court of the king's house. The king, sitting on his throne, saw her, and she bowed down before him. He held out the golden scepter he was holding, and Esther touched the tip of the scepter. The king asked her what her wish and request were. Instead of making an immediate request, Esther invited the king and Haman to a banquet she had prepared. The king accepted the invitation and asked Haman to join them. During the banquet, the king repeated his offer to grant Esther anything she asked, up to half the kingdom. However, Esther postponed her request and invited the king and Haman to another banquet the next day. She said that her request and desire was that if she had found favor in the king's eyes, he would come with Haman to another banquet she would prepare. After the first banquet, Haman left the palace full of pride and joy, but his anger flared when he saw Mordecai at the door, because Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect. When he arrived home, Haman called his friends and his wife together, telling them about his wealth, his many children, and the honors he had received from the king. However, he expressed his frustration at Mordecai's presence, which ruined all his pleasure. Haman told his friends about the riches and multitude of his sons, mentioning how the king had elevated and honored him above the princes and servants. He lamented that no one but him had attended the banquet that Esther had organized, and that he would also be invited by her the next day. However, this did not bring him satisfaction whenever he saw the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. They advised him to build a high gallows and asked the king to hang Mordecai the next day. Haman found the idea agreeable and had the gallows built that night. That same night, King Ahasuerus could not sleep and ordered that the book of Chronicles be brought to him for him to read. During the reading, the record was found that related how Mordecai discovered the plot of Victran and Teresh to assassinate the king. The king asked what honor or distinction had been given to Mordecai for this act, and the servants replied that nothing had been done for him. Then the king asked what honor had been bestowed on Mordecai, and when he learned that nothing had been done, he decided to take action. At that moment, Haman entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows that had been prepared. The king, upon seeing Haman, asked what he would do to the man whose honor the king desired. Haman, thinking that he meant him, suggested that the man whom the king wished to honor should be dressed in royal robes, mounted on the king's horse, and led through the city while a nobleman proclaimed his honor. The king, delighted with the suggestion, ordered Haman to do all this for Mordecai. Haman, filled with humiliation, had to dress Mordecai in royal robes, put him on the king's horse, and proclaim his honor through the streets of the city. After this event, Haman returned home deeply ashamed. Later, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, while Haman, sad and covering his head, went home and told his wife and friends everything that had happened. The wise man and his wife told him that if Mordecai was of the Jewish descent, he would not prevail until he fell before him. That month, one evening, the king and queen attended the second banquet prepared by Esther. During the banquet, the king asked Esther what she wanted, promising to grant her anything up to half the kingdom. Esther finally revealed her request and her identity to the king, asking for her life and that of her people, explaining that they had been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. The king, surprised and furious, asked who was responsible for such an evil plan. Esther replied that she had found favor in the eyes of the king, and if it were granted to her, she asked that her life and that of her people be spared, because if they were sold as servants and maidservants, she would remain silent, but the death of her people would be an irreparable harm to the king. Esther pointed out Haman as the enemy and adversary who had planned the destruction of the Jews, which terrified Haman, who was speechless before the king and queen. The king, full of anger, rose from the banquet, and Haman went out to the palace garden. Upon realizing the king's decision regarding his fate, he remained to beg Queen Esther for his life. In his despair, he threw himself on the couch where Esther was lying, just as the king returned from the garden. Upon seeing this, the king interpreted Haman's action as an attempt to attack the queen in his presence, which further intensified his anger against Esther. It is narrated that, after returning from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman threw himself on the bed where Esther was lying. The king exclaimed, "Does he also want to rape the queen in my own house?" Upon hearing these words, the eunuchs covered Haman's face. Arbona, one of the eunuchs present, informed the king that Haman had prepared a gallows 50 cubits high for Mordecai, who had saved the king's life. The king ordered that Haman be hanged on the same gallows. It is related that Harbin, one of the eunuchs who served the king, said, "This is the gallows that Haman has made for Mordecai, who has spoken well for the king." The king then ordered that Haman be hanged on the gallows that he himself had prepared, thus appeasing his anger. After Haman's execution, the threat against the Jews in the Persian Empire persisted, since the royal decree for their extermination was still in effect. Esther again approached the king, this time uninvited, and fell at his feet, weeping and pleading for her people. The king held out his golden scepter to Esther, allowing her to stand up and speak. It is reported that Esther asked the king to nullify the wickedness of Haman the Agagite and the conspiracy he had hatched against the Jews. The king extended his hand to Esther, and as she stood up, she stood before him, requesting a new decree that would nullify Haman's evil letters and allow the Jews to defend themselves. King Ahasuerus allowed Esther and Mordecai to write a new decree in his name and seal it with his ring. Since a decree issued in the king's name and sealed with his ring could not be revoked, Esther asked that the Jews be informed that they could defend themselves and exterminate anyone who attacked them, including women and children, by confiscating their property. So the king's scribes were summoned to write down the orders in the 3rd month, on the 23rd day. He wrote according to everything that Mordecai had commanded the Jews and the satraps, princes and captains of the provinces, which stretched from India to Ethiopia. The text was written in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed with his ring and sent by messengers riding on the fast horses of the royal dining halls, to whom the king had given authority. The Jews were in every city ready to assemble and defend their lives, ready to destroy, kill, and exterminate any armed force in the city or province that opposed them, even their children and women, and to confiscate their property. The decree was quickly promulgated throughout the empire, and the Jews prepared to defend themselves on the appointed day, the 13th day of the month of Adar. When the day arrived, the Jews assembled in all their cities and defended themselves against their enemies. No one resisted, for fear of the Jews fell upon all the people. In the 10th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the king's decree and his order were to be carried out. However, the opposite happened. The Jews overpowered those who hated them and gathered in their cities, stretching out their hands against those who sought their harm. No one could resist them, for fear seized everyone. The Jews killed 500 men, including Haman's 10 sons, but they did not touch their property. Esther informed the king of the number dead in Susa, and he asked her if she had any further requests. Esther requested that the Jews of Susa be allowed to defend themselves the following day as well, and that the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. The king agreed to Esther's request, and the next day the Jews of Susa killed 300 more men, but again they did not touch the goods. In the other provinces During the reign of the empire, the Jews killed 75,000 of their enemies, but did not confiscate their property. After their victory over their enemies and the salvation of the Jews, Mordecai and Esther took steps to ensure that this miraculous event would be remembered and celebrated by future generations. Mordecai wrote letters to all the Jews in King Ahasuerus' provinces, near and far, ordering them to celebrate Purim annually on the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as days of holiday and joy. It is narrated that Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews in the provinces, ordering them to celebrate the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th annually as the days when the Jews had peace with their enemies, and as the month that had turned from sorrow to joy, turning into days of feasting and celebration. They were instructed to commemorate the change in the fortunes of the Jews from the destruction planned by Haman to victory and rest. The celebration was to include feasts of joy and the sending of portions and gifts to the poor, ensuring that all could participate and remember divine providence. The Jews accepted and began to observe these Purim festivities, according to Mordecai's instructions. Queen Esther also sent letters confirming and establishing the celebration as a permanent ordinance for all Jews. These letters were written with royal authority and sent throughout the kingdom, ensuring that the celebration of Purim would be observed uniformly and continuously. It is narrated that Queen Esther, daughter of Abil, and Mordecai the Jew wrote with full authority to confirm the second Purim letter, and the letters were sent to all the Jews in the provinces of King Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, confirming these days at the appointed times, as Mordecai the Jew and the queen had commanded them. Esther and Mordecai took upon themselves and their descendants the obligation to commemorate the end of 2 fasts and their cry for Esther's commandment by establishing these celebrations on Purim. This was written into the book so that the holiday of Purim would be a lasting observance for the Jews, remembering their deliverance from destruction and celebrating divine intervention on their behalf. The story of Esther concludes with Mordecai's elevation to a position of great influence in the kingdom of Persia after the fall of Haman. King Ahasuerus gave Haman's house to Esther, who appointed Mordecai in charge of it. Mordecai was promoted to a position second in authority to the king. It is recorded that King Ahasuerus paid tribute to the land and to all the assets of his power and authority. The story of Mordecai's greatness, whom the king exalted, is not recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia, for Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, great among the Jews and esteemed by the multitude of his brethren, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all. Mordecai stood out for his wisdom and dedication to the welfare of his people. His loyalty and bravery not only saved the Jews, but also raised them to a position of honor and respect. Thus, the story of Esther and Mordecai becomes a lasting testimony of divine providence, courage, and faithfulness. The narrative offers us valuable lessons about faith and the intervention of divine providence. Despite facing great dangers, Esther and Mordecai trusted God and acted bravely, resulting in the salvation of their people. The story of Esther is a powerful reminder that in any situation, divine providence can work through courageous and faithful individuals to accomplish its purposes. The celebration of Purim continues to be an expression of gratitude and joy for divine protection and salvation. Now, we invite you to join this community of faith and spirituality, where together we can explore the depths of the Scriptures and find guidance and comfort in the stories of those who have gone before us. Subscribe to this channel to continue discovering the mysteries of faith and share with us your reflections and experiences. Comment with your thoughts and how this story has touched your life or your understanding of spirituality. Share this video with those who, like you, look to ancient stories of faith for light for the modern path. See you in a new video. May God bless you.